Hello. On June 1st of this year, Mexico became the first country in history to elect every single one of its judges by popular vote. 97 million Mexicans could choose their Supreme Court justices, their magistrates, and their local judges. It was called democracy in action, and yet only 13% of voters showed up, and a fifth of those cast blank ballots. Why? Because this wasn't really about democracy. Just like in Israel, where hundreds of thousands filled the streets to stop judicial reforms. Just like in Hungary and Poland, where ruling parties have already succeeded in turning courts into partisan tools. The logic is always the same. Elected leaders argue that unelected judges block the will of the people. But when politicians rewrite the courts, are they strengthening democracy, or are they stripping away its last guardrails? This is Policymaker. Around the world recently, you notice an unprecedented assault on judicial independence, disguised as democratic reform. The question isn't whether judges should serve the people, it's whether democracies can survive when its courts stop being neutral referees and instead become instruments of political power. To understand what's happening, we need to grasp what courts actually do in a democracy. Courts are meant to be democracy's neutral referees, the institutions that decide when governments have overstepped their bounds, when laws violate constitutional principles, and when political actors have broken the rules of the game. In practice, this depends entirely on judicial independence. The French political theorist Montesquieu wrote in 1748, "There is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers." When judges fear for their jobs or owe their positions to politicians, or can be punished for unpopular decisions, they become too conflicted to serve as impartial. The intended separation of powers isn't an abstract concept. It really is the immune system of democracy. The legislature makes the laws, the executive enforces them, and the judiciary interprets them independently. Each branch checks the other's power. If you remove that independence, you get what political scientists consider tyranny by the majority, where winning an election gives you the right to rewrite all the rules. But around the world, elected leaders are discovering that judicial independence stands, unfortunately for them, in their way. Whether it's Mexican President López Obrador frustrated with the court's rulings against his energy policies, or Netanyahu trying to escape corruption charges, or Orbán in Hungary wanting to consolidate power, the courts kept saying no. So these leaders ask a seductive question. Why should unelected judges frustrate the will of the elected representatives? Why shouldn't courts serve the people who voted? The answer lies in what happens when politicians actually get their way. We can trace this pattern across 4 cases. Mexico represents perhaps the most radical experiment. Former President López Obrador argued that Mexico's federal judiciary was riddled with corruption and elitism. His solution? Let the people choose their judges directly. This constitutional reform calls for the elections of all federal and state justices, magistrates, and judges, nearly 7,000 positions in total. But the June 2025 elections revealed the flaws in this logic. With thousands of candidates competing, ballots listed over 150 names on a single page. Voters face an impossible task. How do you evaluate a judicial candidate's qualifications when legal expertise can't be campaigned on like policy positions? In other words, how do you sell law school classes to voters? The result was predictable chaos, massive voter confusion, and the lowest voter turnout for any Mexican election in decades. More troubling is that the reform creates a new judicial discipline tribunal with power to supervise, review, and sanction judges' work and decisions. As the Washington office on Latin America notes, this will place further pressure on judges to adhere to whatever political influences are dominant at the national level. This plays out with judges who know they can be voted out or disciplined by political appointees, being unable to make unpopular but legally correct decisions. In Israel, we see the opposite reaction to the same underlying tension. Netanyahu's government, frustrated with Supreme Court rulings, proposed limiting the court's power to overturn government decisions deemed, quote, extremely unreasonable. Justice Minister Yariv Levin argued that Israel's judiciary was too powerful, too liberal, and too willing to interfere with the elected government. Ordinary Israelis understood the stakes here. The BBC reports that hundreds of thousands took to the streets in what organizers called the biggest street demonstrations in Israel's history. Crucially, military reservists, including Air Force pilots essential to Israel's defense, threatened to refuse service if the reforms passed. They recognized that weakening judicial oversight would threaten the idea of democracy itself. When the government passed the first piece of legislation anyway, the Supreme Court struck it down in December 2023. The court ruled 8-3 that removing its reasonableness standard would cause, quote, severe and unprecedented damage to the basic characteristics of the State of Israel as a democratic state. Israeli democracy survived, barely, because its courts retained enough independence to protect themselves. Hungary and Poland show what happens when judicial reforms succeed. Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, with a 2/3 parliamentary majority, used constitutional amendments to systematically capture the courts. Parliament removed the Constitutional Court's power to review financial laws after the court declared a government tax unconstitutional. In 2013, Parliament went further, invalidating all court decisions made before 2012. Poland's Law and Justice Party took a different approach, using both legal and illegal methods. As documented by researchers from Dartmouth College, the party packed the courts with loyalists, created disciplinary chambers to punish independent judges, and implemented gag rules preventing judges from criticizing reforms. The Council of Europe's constitutional advisory body, the Venice Commission, condemned these actions as violations of judicial independence. The result is that in both countries, courts have become extensions of executive power. Judges in Hungary and Poland learned that ruling against the government carried professional consequences. Independent judicial decision-making disappeared and was effectively replaced by political calculation. Even in the United Kingdom, similar pressures emerge. While the Reform UK party hasn't proposed systematic judicial overhaul, their rhetoric about, quote, taking back control of our courts reflects the same underlying frustration with judicial constraints on political power. Their focus remains primarily on criminal justice and immigration law, rather than constitutional restructuring, but the language echoes the pattern seen elsewhere. The pattern is clear across all cases. Judicial reform is not ultimately about efficiency or modernization, it's about power. Politicians facing judicial constraints do not merely improve courts, they will in practice control them, whether it's through elections, appointments, disciplinary measures, or constitutional amendments. The goal remains the same, making courts serve political masters rather than legal principles. And the consequences extend beyond individual cases. According to the World Justice Project's 2023 Rule of Law Index, 2/3 of countries saw their civil justice scores decline. When courts lose independence, they lose legitimacy. Citizens will stop trusting legal institutions to resolve decisions fairly, and that creates instability, undermining democratic governance itself. This leaves us with a fundamental question. In a democracy, who should have the final word? Is the majority of the moment or the enduring framework of law? The global evidence suggests that weakening judicial independence, regardless of the justification, fundamentally alters democratic governance. Mexico's chaotic elections, Israel's mass resistance, and Hungary and Poland's captured courts all demonstrate the same truth. When courts become political instruments, democracies lose their neutral referees. The deeper risk lies in what is called democratic backsliding. Historically, leaders who successfully weaken judicial oversight don't stop there. They use their unconstrained power to further erode democratic institutions. Again, courts represent democracy's immune system. If you remove that protection, political disputes become resolvable not by law, but by force of numbers, wealth, or street power. And so when politicians demand that courts serve the people, I would argue we should ask, Which people? Today's electoral majority? Tomorrow's? Or the constitutional principles designed to protect everyone's rights, even when popular opinion shifts? Perhaps the real measure of judicial reform isn't whether it makes courts more democratic, but whether democracy can survive without independent judges to enforce its own rules. This is Policymaker. Thank you.